My famous artist husband claimed my masterpieces as his own and locked me away. So I painted one final portrait that exposed his crimes to the world and left him with nothing but a canvas of lies. In the heart of a sterile, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the shimmering skyline of Manhattan, Elena lives as a ghost. To the world, her husband Julian Vane is a visionary of the decade, a contemporary art god whose every brushstroke is worth millions. But inside their cold, high-tech fortress, the truth is far more sinister. Elena is the true hand behind the Vane legacy. For nearly 10 years, Julian has kept Elena in a state of psychological imprisonment, using sophisticated gaslighting to convince her, and the media, that she is a fragile soul, struggling with severe mental illness. He tells the press he nurtures her through her darkness, while in reality, he steals her light, signing his name to her blood, sweat, and genius. The breaking point arrives when Julian announces his career-defining exhibition at the Guggenheim, titled The Muse. Elena discovers the digital catalog where she is described not as a partner, but as a troubled ward he rescued from poverty. A quick pause before we continue. Please leave a word in the comments. We'd love to know where this video has found you today. Your likes and subscriptions mean everything to us. For those who are already with us, we wish you a life full of peace, happiness, and ever-growing blessings. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of our Manhattan penthouse, New York City is a chaotic symphony of light and ambition. From the 50th floor, the yellow cabs look like frantic beetles scurrying through the arteries of a concrete giant, and the neon glow of Times Square bleeds into the night sky like a fresh bruise. The world out there is vibrant, screaming with a life I am no longer allowed to touch. Inside, however, the air is filtered, sterile, and heavy with the scent of linseed oil and turpentine, the smells of my creation and my captivity. I stand before a massive canvas, my hand trembling slightly as I hold a grade 0 sable brush. I am finishing the detail on a skyline that looks suspiciously like the one mocking me through the window, but in my version, the shadows are longer, deeper, more predatory. I've used a heavy impasto technique for the buildings, piling on the paint until they feel like a physical weight, a fortress of pigment that mirrors the glass one Julian has built around me. Almost there, Elena. Just a bit more chiaroscuro in the alleyways. We want the viewer to feel the danger of a city, the need for a savior. A voice resonates behind me. It is Julian. His voice is a rich baritone, the kind that sells millions of dollars of art with a single anecdote. I don't need to turn around to feel his presence. He brings with him the scent of expensive bourbon and the suffocating chill of a man who owns everything he touches. I take a breath, the turpentine stinging my lungs. The light is already fading, Julian. If I add more shadow, the central piece will lose its focus. I hear his leather loafers click against the white marble floor, a sound like a ticking clock in an empty room. He stops just inches behind me. I can feel the heat radiating from his body, yet it provides no warmth. His hand, smooth and uncalloused, the hand of a man who hasn't truly worked a brush in a decade, lands on my shoulder. He leans in, his lips brushing my ear, and for a moment, the world narrows down to his grip. It is meant to be a loving gesture, a supportive husband guiding his fragile muse, but to me, it feels like a chokehold. His thumb presses into the soft skin of my neck, a subtle reminder of who holds the keys to this glass cage. "You're getting emotional again, darling," he whispers, his tone dripping with the patronizing tenderness that has become my daily bread. The world doesn't want your raw, unrefined honesty. They want the mystery I curate for them. Without my name in that bottom right corner, this is just the rambling of a depressed woman in a high-rise. But with me, it's a masterpiece on the human condition. The air in my chest feels like lead paint. He's using sfumato on our reality, blurring the lines of where I end, and he begins until I am nothing but a phantom limb of his own ambition. Julian reaches around me, his fingers closing over mine on the brush handle. His touch is firm, guiding my hand toward the canvas. He dips the brush into a glob of ivory black and, with one swift, arrogant stroke, he obliterates the delicate light I spent 3 hours perfecting. "There," he says, stepping back to admire his, or rather my work. "That's the Vane touch. That's what the Guggenheim is paying for." He looks at the painting not as a piece of a soul, but as a transaction. He sees the millions of dollars, the rave reviews in the New York Times, and the fawning adoration of the elite. He does not see the scars on my fingers or the hollowness in my eyes. The early preview for the private collectors is next week, Julian says, returning to his professional, martyr-like persona. I'll tell them I spent weeks in a trance-like state to achieve that specific shade of blue. You understand, don't you, Elena? It's for our future. For your safety. I look down at my nails, stained with the pigments of a life I am not allowed to claim. Will they ever know, Julian? Just once. He laughs softly, a sound like sandpaper on silk. He turns me around, cupping my face in his hands. His eyes are dark, beautiful, and utterly devoid of empathy. Elena, my sweet, broken bird, the world out there would tear you apart, he says, his voice a perfect imitation of concern. The critics would dissect your trauma for sport. The media would hunt you down. You aren't strong enough for the light, darling. Let me be your shield. Let me take the bullets while you stay pure here in the only sanctuary you have. Sanctuary, I think. This penthouse is a velvet-lined coffin. I've ordered a new dress for you for the gala dinner tonight, he adds, smoothing my hair. Some board members from the foundation are coming. Remember your role, Elena. You are the quiet inspiration, the shy muse who doesn't talk shop. Let me handle the philosophy. He kisses my forehead, a seal of ownership, and walks out with the effortless grace of a king who just inspected his most valuable slave. Once the heavy door clicks shut, he always locks it, claiming it's to protect my focus. I turn back to the canvas. I stare at the black smear he forced onto my skyline. My hands aren't shaking anymore. I pick up a palette knife, but I don't scrape away the black. Instead, I begin to mix colors he would hate. I mix a alizarin crimson that looks like an open wound, a violet that resembles a deep bruise, and a white as cold as bone. Julian thinks he is perfecting his mystery. He doesn't know that beneath these thick layers of impasto, I am planting the seeds of his destruction. If he wants me to be his shadow, then I will be a shadow dark enough to swallow his entire sun. I press the knife to the canvas. Every stroke now is a promise. A final portrait is forming in my mind, not a landscape, but a map of a betrayal that I will frame so beautifully that when the world sees it, they won't be able to look away from the truth. The scent of linseed oil no longer feels like a weight. It feels like the smell of a battlefield. And I am the artist who has just begun to draw the front lines. I rest the palette knife against the edge of the easel, my breathing shallow. The cold Manhattan glass reflects a woman I barely recognize, but my mind is no longer in this high-rise prison. It has drifted back 10 years, to a sun-drenched, dust-filled studio in Brooklyn, where the air smelled of cheap espresso and the kind of reckless hope that only the young can afford. In 2016, New York was a different city to me. It wasn't a cage, it was a canvas. I was a student at one of the most prestigious art institutes in the world, a girl from a small town who spoke through her brushes because her voice always felt too small for the room. And then there was Julian. Julian wasn't the best painter in our cohort. His strokes were often derivative, his compositions leaning heavily on the clichés of the masters. But Julian possessed a brilliance that had nothing to do with the canvas. He was a master of charisma, a human lightning rod who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they were standing in the presence of a sun. He was the chiaroscuro of the student body, bright, blindingly confident, and casting a long, dark shadow over anyone who stood too close. Art isn't just about the pigment, Elena, he told me one rainy evening, leaning over my shoulder as I worked on a raw, visceral study of my mother's hands. It's about the myth. It's about who tells the story. I was 21 and starving for more than just food. I was starving for a witness. Julian became that witness. He convinced me that he was the only one who truly saw the feral beauty of my work. We became an inseparable unit, a partnership that I believed was built on a foundation of mutual respect and burgeoning love. The turning point came during our senior thesis exhibition. I had spent 6 months locked away, pouring every ounce of my grief over my father's recent death into a massive, 3-panel piece titled The Weight of Light. It was my soul laid bare, a complex exploration of loss using a specific, archaic method of glazing that gave the painting an ethereal, pulsating depth. It was the best thing I had ever created. It was the best thing I might ever create. 2 days before the opening, a prominent gallerist from Chelsea visited the student previews. He stood before my triptych for 40 minutes, silent and transfixed. That night, Julian came to my tiny apartment with a bottle of cheap wine and a look of profound, manufactured tragedy. He took my hands in his, hands that were stained to the cuticles with the dark blues and grays of that painting. Elena, he loved it. He said it's a career maker, Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a manipulation I was too naive to name. But there's a problem. He told me the market is oversaturated with female domestic trauma right now. He's looking for a masculine intensity to anchor his fall collection. He thinks it's mine because I was the one who helped him navigate the studio while you were at your part-time job. The room felt like it was tilting. But you told him the truth, Julian. You told him it was mine. Julian squeezed my fingers, his eyes filling with tears that I now realize were merely a well-rehearsed performance. Laura, listen to me. If I tell him the truth, he walks. We lose the contract. We lose the chance to move out of this dump and start our life together. But if we let him believe it's mine, we win. I can be the face, the name they want to buy. And you get to be the genius who doesn't have to worry about the rent. You get to paint, and I'll be your armor. I'll protect you from the ugliness of the industry. But it's my name, Julian, I breathed, the first cracks appearing in my heart. It's my father. It's my grief. Your father's memory deserves a life of luxury, not a struggle in a basement, he countered, his voice hardening just enough to make me feel selfish. We are a team. My name is just a brand, Elena. But the soul inside, that will always be ours. Don't you trust me? I wanted to be loved more than I wanted to be known. That was my greatest sin. That night, I traded my identity for the promise of protection. I watched as Julian signed his flamboyant, arrogant signature in the bottom right corner of my morning. I watched as he accepted the praise, the checks, and the fame for a pain he had never felt and a technique he could never master. It was the first time I was erased, but it wouldn't be the last. As we moved from that Brooklyn basement to this Manhattan glass fortress, the team became a hierarchy. The protection became a prison. Julian didn't just take my name, he colonized my history. He began to tell interviewers about his childhood, his losses, and his spiritual journey, all of which were fragments of my life that he had harvested like a parasite. Standing here now, looking at the black smear he just added to my new work, I realized that 2016 wasn't just a theft, it was a murder. He killed the version of me that believed in the sanctity of the canvas. I pick up the palette knife again. My touch is lighter now, more precise. I am no longer that girl in Brooklyn. I am a restorer of my own truth. Julian thinks he buried the evidence of his fraud in the years of silence he imposed upon me. He thinks the fragile wife he presents to New York is the only version of me left. He has forgotten about the pentimento, the phenomenon where the original lines of a painting reappear years later, refusing to stay hidden under the artist's second thoughts. You took my 2016, Julian, I whisper to the empty room. But you won't take my 2026. I begin to sketch the underlying layer of my final portrait. I use a lead-based white that will outlast any of his superficial glazes. Beneath the beautiful face of the master I am about to paint, I will stitch the original sin of our union. I will paint the contract he made me sign in blood and linseed oil. I will paint the theft that started it all. The city lights outside are blinding, but for the first time in a decade, I am the one controlling the light on the canvas. The blue light of my iPad screen is the only thing that pierces the heavy, curated darkness of the living room. I am sitting on the edge of the Italian leather sofa, a piece of furniture that costs more than my father's entire house in the suburbs, yet offers no comfort to a body that feels like it's made of glass. Outside, the New York skyline continues its relentless shimmering, but inside, I am performing a digital autopsy on my own life. I tap on the colorful ring of Julian's Instagram story. The first frame is a high-resolution photo of a bouquet of white peonies sitting on the marble kitchen island. The caption is written in a minimalist font, dripping with a performative grace that makes my stomach churn. Flowers for my brave flower. Every day is a battle with the shadows, but we fight it together. Hashtag mental health awareness, hashtag the muse, hashtag art life. I stare at the screen. Julian didn't buy those flowers. His third assistant, a girl named Maya who looks at me with a mixture of pity and terror, brought them in 3 hours ago. Julian wasn't even home. He was at a power lunch at Le Bernardin, probably discussing the visceral suffering of his latest work. But on the screen, he is the saint of Manhattan, the devoted husband tending to a mentally fragile wife. I swipe to the next story. It's a video. The camera is steady, likely a tripod, and Julian is sitting in the library, the warm light of a designer lamp hitting his jawline perfectly. A lot of you ask how I stay so prolific, he says to the lens, his voice a masterclass in practiced humility. The truth is, my inspiration comes from a place of deep, private struggle. Living with someone who experiences the world as intensely as Elena does, it's a beautiful, heavy burden. Her darkness is the ink I use to write my light. We're in a difficult season right now, so thank you for respecting our privacy as she heals. He sighs, a perfect 1-second exhale, and looks away from the camera, the image of a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The pain is no longer a sharp sting. It is a dull, rhythmic ache, like a heartbeat made of lead. I am watching my soul being curated into a digital lie. He has taken my actual pain, the exhaustion of being his ghostwriter, the grief of losing my identity, and rebranded it as a mental health struggle to explain why I am never seen in public. He has turned my isolation into his marketing strategy. I scroll down to the comments. Julian, you are an absolute angel. Most men would have walked away. Elena is so lucky to have such a supportive partner. Sending prayers for her recovery. The way Julian advocates for mental health through his art is so moving. A true visionary. I feel a cold, dry laugh catch in my throat. I am the one who is lucky. I am the lucky woman locked in a 50-story cage while the man who stole my life receives standing ovations for his empathy. This is the modern anatomy of a betrayal. It doesn't happen in dark alleys. It happens in polished squares of light, liked and shared by millions. I am crafting a psychological drama where the betrayal is as elegant as it is sharp. This isn't just a story. It's the blueprint for my survival. I stand up and walk toward my studio, the iPad still glowing in my hand. I pass a mirror in the hallway and stop. I look at the woman Julian has created. I am pale, my hair is unbrushed, and my eyes are wide with the haunted look of someone who has been told they are unwell for so long that they started to believe it. Julian's greatest masterpiece isn't the paintings on the walls. It's me. I am the living installation of his martyrdom. I enter the studio and shut the door. The lock clicks, a sound that used to represent my defeat, but now represents my laboratory. I approach the canvas where the master is beginning to take shape. Julian wants a portrait that captures his visionary spirit for the Guggenheim. He wants the world to see the man from the Instagram stories, the saint, the protector, the genius. I pick up a tube of zinc white. I mix it with a touch of ultramarine, creating a color that looks like the cold, artificial glow of a smartphone screen. I begin to paint the reflection in Julian's eyes. From a distance, it will look like a sparkle of inspiration. But under the light I am preparing, that sparkle will transform into the UI of a social media app, a cage made of pixels and lies. Every comment I read tonight, every fake prayer for my recovery, every lie he told his followers, I am stitching them all into the texture of his skin. I am using an impasto, so thick that his face will literally be built out of the layers of his deception. You think you're an angel, Julian? I whisper to the empty room, my brush moving with a terrifying, silent precision. I'm going to make sure the world sees exactly what kind of heaven you've built for me. I am no longer the shy muse who doesn't talk shop. I am the architect of a revenge that will be as viral as his lies. He thinks the internet is his greatest ally. He doesn't realize that I am painting a portrait that will turn his own followers into his witnesses. The fajar of the truth is coming, and it won't be filtered. The silence of this penthouse has a frequency. It is a high-pitched, digital hum that vibrates in the marrow of my bones, a constant reminder that even the air here is processed, filtered, and monitored. This glass fortress is designed to keep the world's noise out, but it also ensures that my own voice never travels further than the soundproofed walls. I was looking for a charger for my iPad, the one Julian monitors, when I found it, tucked away in the back of a drawer in the library, beneath a stack of Julian's self-congratulatory coffee table books, was my old tablet. It was a relic from 2018, a time when I still believed my thoughts belonged to me. I had hidden it years ago, afraid he would wipe it clean, and eventually I had forgotten its existence. My hands shook as I plugged it into a dusty cable. The screen flickered to life, the low battery icon a desperate red heartbeat. When it finally breathed again, I didn't look for photos or old messages. I felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the podcast app. I needed to hear the world. I needed to know if the lie was still growing. The top trending episode of The Creative Mind featured a face I knew better than my own. Julian. I hit play. The audio was crisp, professional, and devastating. Julian's voice filled the room, smooth as velvet and just as heavy. "You know, Marcus," Julian said to the host, his tone intimate and confiding. "People often ask me where the color of silence comes from. They see my work, the dark blues, the suffocating grays, and they wonder how a man in my position can access that level of isolation." I froze. The color of silence. "For me," Julian continued, "it's about the anatomy of a scream. I often wake up at 3 a.m. and feel as though my soul is a room with no doors. I wrote in my notebook recently, the canvas is not a surface. It is a witness to the thoughts I am too afraid to speak aloud. Every stroke of Prussian blue is a layer of skin I am shedding to keep from drowning in my own mind." The tablet nearly slipped from my fingers. Those weren't his words. They weren't his metaphors. I stood up and walked, my movements mechanical, to the floorboard beneath my easel. I pried it loose, reaching for the small, leather-bound journal I had kept hidden for years, the one I wrote in when the gaslighting became too much, when I needed to prove to myself that I still existed. I flipped to the entry dated November 14th, 2024. There it was, word for word, the anatomy of a scream. A room with no doors, Prussian blue as a layer of skin. A cold, hollow sensation opened up in my chest, wider and deeper than any grief I had felt before. He hadn't just stolen my brushes. He hadn't just claimed my paintings. Julian was colonizing my very thoughts. He had found my journals. He had read the most private, fragile corners of my mind and harvested them like raw materials for his brand. Listening to him was like watching a ghost inhabit my body and use my tongue to speak. He was performing my internal monologue for an audience of millions, receiving standing ovations for the suffering he had caused me. He had turned my survival mechanism into his marketing copy. "It's a heavy burden," Julian's voice droned on, dripping with a sickening, manufactured empathy. "But if my struggle, my private, lonely darkness, can help others feel seen, then it's worth it." I hit the power button, plunging the room back into that sterile, Manhattan silence. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was no longer an individual to him. I was an asset. I was a content farm. Julian didn't just want my talent. He wanted to own the way I perceived the world, so that he could sell it back to the public with his signature on the receipt. I looked at my hands. They were stained with the same Prussian blue he had just described so poetically. My fury was no longer a fire. It was a glacier, slow, silent, and unstoppable. He thought he was safe because he had taken everything. He thought that by stealing my words, he had left me with no way to tell the truth. I walked back to the final portrait. I picked up a fine liner pen, the kind used for architectural drafting. Using a pigment that was invisible to the naked eye but would glow like a neon sign under the gala's UV spotlights, I began to write. I didn't paint shapes. I wrote. I wrote every word he had stolen from my journal. I wrote the dates he had entered my mind without permission. I wrote the exact sentences he had used in the podcast, weaving them into the texture of his painted suit, the wrinkles of his forehead, and the highlights of his hair. I was literally building his image out of the words he had stolen from me. "You want my thoughts, Julian?" I whispered, the static in my head finally clearing into a sharp, lethal focus. "You'll have all of them. Every dark corner, every silent scream, every secret you thought you could claim. I'm going to make sure that when the lights hit this canvas, the world won't just see your face. They will read my mind." He thought the internet was his greatest ally because it amplified his lies. He didn't realize that I was creating a physical, analog backup of the truth that no algorithm could delete. I am no longer the shy muse. I am the one who remembers. And I am painting a portrait that will turn his own voice into the evidence of his crime. The fajar of the truth is coming, and it will be written in my own hand. The night air in our Manhattan penthouse felt thinner, colder, as if the glass walls were slowly exhaling the warmth of the day into the uncaring New York skyline. Julian came home later than usual, his footsteps echoing against the marble with a rhythmic arrogance that signaled a triumph. He didn't go to the kitchen for water or to the bedroom to change. He walked straight into my studio, smelling of expensive gin and the intoxicating scent of a man who had just been told he owned the world. "It's happening, Elena," he said, his eyes bright with a predatory fever. "The contracts are signed. A solo show. The Guggenheim. In 3 months." I stood frozen by my easel, the brush in my hand dripping a single, lonely tear of ultramarine. The Guggenheim. It was the pinnacle, the dream we had whispered about in that dusty Brooklyn basement 10 years ago. But back then, the we had meant a partnership of souls. Now it was a monologue. "The show is titled The Muse," Julian continued, pacing the room, his shadow stretching long and distorted across my unfinished work. "It's going to be a retrospective of our most intense years. They want the new portrait as the centerpiece, the one you're finishing. It's the closing statement of a vain legacy." He didn't look at me. He looked through me, as if I were merely a piece of studio equipment that needed to be calibrated for the final production. He poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on my side table and began talking about PR strategies, about the narrative of the suffering artist, and about how this would cement his place in history. I waited until the early hours of the morning, long after the gin had pulled him into a heavy, snoring sleep. The penthouse was silent, save for the hum of the climate control. I crept into his office, the glow of his MacBook Pro a cold, accusing light in the darkness. I found the file. Guggenheim_solo_catalog_draft_v4.pdf. My fingers were numb as I scrolled through the pages. I saw my paintings, the ones that had cost me my sleep, my health, and my sanity, credited to his name in bold, authoritative type. But it was the artist's statement and the biographical note that finally shattered the last remaining pieces of my heart. Julian Vane's work is a testament to the transformative power of empathy. Much of his mid-career depth is attributed to his role as the sole guardian and protector of his wife, Elena, a troubled ward he rescued from a life of crushing poverty and psychological obscurity. Elena, who struggled with a fragile, fragmented reality, serves as the silent anchor for Vane's explorations of the human condition. Vane describes his process as distilling her silence into light, a noble burden that he carries with a martyr's grace. A troubled ward, rescued from poverty. The words blurred as the first sob hit me, a violent, silent convulsion that felt like it was tearing my ribs apart. I wasn't just his ghostwriter or his secret painter anymore. In the eyes of the world, I was a charity case. I was a broken thing he had picked up out of the dirt to polish his own halo. He had completely erased my education, my talent, my history, and my humanity. He had turned me into a prop in his own hagiography. I looked at my hands in the pale light of the screen. These hands had spent a decade building his palace. These hands had painted the very textures that critics called divine. And yet, according to this document, these hands belonged to a woman who couldn't even grasp reality. And then, the sobbing stopped. It didn't fade. It simply ceased, replaced by a cold, crystalline stillness that I had never felt before. It was the breaking point. The grief that had been my constant companion for 10 years suddenly calcified. It turned into a weapon. I realized then that I could not leave him. Not yet. If I ran now, I would remain the troubled ward who vanished into the night. I would be a footnote in his legend. If I wanted my life back, I had to do more than escape. I had to perform an elegant revenge. I had to use the very stage he had built for himself to strip him bare. The plan didn't arrive in pieces. It arrived as a complete, finished canvas in my mind. I closed the laptop and walked back to my studio. I looked at the final portrait of Julian, the one that was supposed to be his closing statement at the Guggenheim. I picked up a bottle of fluorescent glaze and a series of rare, light-reactive chemicals I had been researching in secret. I would give him the masterpiece he demanded. I would paint the most beautiful, visionary portrait of Julian Vane the world had ever seen. But I would build it in layers. The layer of lies. The surface would be the Julian the world loved, the saint, the protector, the genius. The layer of truth. Beneath the surface, using pigments that only reacted to a specific UV frequency, I would stitch the reality. I would embed the micro-printed pages of my journals he had stolen. I would paint the dates of every time he had locked me in this room. I would paint the image of myself, not as a troubled ward, but as the architect of every brushstroke he claimed. You want to distill my silence into light, Julian? I whispered, my voice sounding like a stranger's in the empty room. Then I will give you a light, so bright it will burn your house of cards to the ground. I picked up my palette knife. The movement was no longer heavy with sorrow, it was surgical. I began to mix a base layer of zinc white and lead, a foundation that would hold the weight of the exposé I was about to create. He thought he was preparing for a coronation. He didn't realize he was commissioning his own public execution. The Guggenheim wouldn't be his sanctuary, it would be his courtroom. And I, the silent anchor, was about to become the storm. I didn't need to cry anymore. I had work to do. I had a masterpiece to finish, one that would finally, elegantly, leave him with nothing but a canvas of lies. The air in my Manhattan studio has changed. It no longer carries the heavy, stagnant scent of a cage. It smells of a laboratory, of a secret revolution. I move with a new, surgical precision, my movements dictated by a cold clarity that Julian would never understand. To him, I was still his fragile bird, fluttering uselessly against the glass. He didn't realize that I had stopped trying to fly away. I was busy building the storm that would shatter the glass from the inside. I spent the first few days of this new phase in a state of hyper-focused research. I couldn't use the primary iPad, the one Julian checked for signs of my recovery, so I relied on the old tablet I'd found, tethered to a neighbor's unsecured Wi-Fi. I delved into the chemistry of restoration and the world of high-end forgery, looking for the specific tools I needed to hide a scream in plain sight. I needed pigments that were dormant under normal gallery lighting but would ignite like a wildfire under the specific frequencies of ultraviolet light. My shopping lists became cryptic. I ordered specialized cleaning resins, rare botanical extracts like quinine, and synthetic fluorescent powders from industrial suppliers in Long Island City. When the packages arrived, Julian barely looked up from his morning espresso. He saw a wife taking a renewed interest in technical perfection and archival stability. He saw a tool sharpening itself for his benefit. He didn't see the woman preparing a poison that tasted like light. Painting the layer of truth was an agonizingly slow process. I worked in the dead of night, the only illumination coming from a handheld UV torch I'd modified. In the darkness, the canvas looked like a void, but under the violet glow of my torch, it was a searing, electric battlefield. I used a fine liner brush, the kind used for the most delicate microscopic work, and I began to write. I didn't start with images. I started with the words Julian had colonizing my mind. I wrote the dates of my erasures. I wrote the times he had called me unstable to justify his theft. I wrote the exact dollar amounts of the sales he had made while I sat in the dark, wondering if I was indeed losing my mind. I wove these words into the very grain of the linen, creating a texture of suffering that was literally the foundation of the portrait. It was a strange, haunting sensation to see my most private agonies glowing in a neon blue Pandaren, a secret language that only the darkness and I understood. There was a profound, yet heart-wrenching irony in the work. Each stroke was a liberation, yet each one had to be perfectly smooth, perfectly flat, so as not to create a physical ghost that Julian might detect when the normal lights were back on. I was hiding my screams under layers of beautiful, traditional glazes. I was a restorer of my own tragedy, carefully applying the varnish of a happy marriage over the raw, bleeding ink of my reality. As the days bled into weeks, the emotional toll began to manifest as a physical ache. My hands, usually so steady, would cramp from the tension of maintaining the secret. Sometimes, I would find myself staring at the canvas under normal light, seeing only the handsome, visionary face of Julian Vane, and I would feel a moment of vertigo. Was the truth really there? Or had the gaslighting finally worked? I would have to click on the UV light just to prove to myself that I hadn't disappeared, that my evidence was still burning beneath the surface. Julian would often come into the studio to check on his masterpiece. He would stand before the painting, his hand resting on my shoulder in that familiar, suffocating grip. He would comment on the soulful depth I was achieving in his eyes, never realizing that the depth he admired was actually a micro-printed scan of my own psychiatric evaluation, the one he had faked to keep me under his control. He was admiring the very tools of my oppression, thinking they were his own creative breakthroughs. "The layering here is remarkable, Elena," he said one evening, his voice dripping with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. "It's as if there's a secret world behind the paint. It's exactly what the Guggenheim wants. They want the mystery. They want to feel like they're seeing something that isn't quite there." I looked him in the eyes, my pulse a frantic drum in my ears. "You have no idea how much is actually there, Julian." He chuckled, a sound like a silk cord tightening around a neck. "That's my girl. Keep that intensity. It's what makes my work so timeless." When he left, I turned off the main lights. I clicked on the UV torch. The secret world he so carelessly praised exploded into life. The words he stole my 2016 glowed across his forehead like a brand. The image of the Brooklyn basement, rendered in a ghost-white fluorescence, appeared behind his shoulder. My truth was there, vibrant and electric, waiting for the moment when the world's lights would change and his lies would finally be stripped bare. This was the anatomy of my revenge, a slow, meticulous stitching of evidence into the fabric of his vanity. I was no longer painting a portrait of a man, I was painting a trap. Every chemical reaction I tested, every layer of transparent glaze I applied, was a step closer to the fajar of his destruction. I was tired, I was broken, and I was desperately alone. But for the first time in a decade, I was the one holding the brush, and I knew exactly what the ending would look like. The Guggenheim Gala was 2 months away. 60 days to finish the most beautiful lie in New York City history. 60 days to ensure that the master would be left with nothing but a canvas that finally told the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The mask doesn't just sit on my face anymore. It has started to fuse with my skin, a seamless layer of transparent varnish that hides the rot beneath. Living with Julian in these final 60 days is like performing a high-stakes waltz on a floor made of thin, cracked eggshells, where every step must be light enough to leave no mark, yet firm enough to maintain the rhythm of his delusion. I am a master of the vain touch now, not just on the canvas, but in the way I breathe, the way I tilt my head, and the most agonizingly, the way I let him love me. Every morning begins with the same curated ritual. I wake up before the sun has even managed to climb over the jagged teeth of the Manhattan skyline, sitting in the gray shadows of our bedroom while Julian sleeps with the heavy, uncomplicated peace of a man who believes he has conquered fate. I watch him, and I feel a hollow, freezing sensation. There was a time when this face was my North Star. Now it is just a landscape of deception I have to navigate to survive. When he finally stirs, I am already wearing the expression he expects. The soft, slightly dazed look of a woman still finding her way back from the fog. "How is my brave girl today?" he asks, his voice thick with sleep and an ownership that makes my skin crawl. "Better, Julian. The fog is lifting," I reply, the lie sliding off my tongue as smooth as oil paint. I have learned to modulate my voice, to strip it of a sharp, lethal clarity I feel in my chest. I offer him the submissive smile he craves, the one that confirms his status as my savior. Yes, Julian, and you're right, Julian is a drop of acid I swallow in private, but on the surface, I am the picture of domestic devotion. The psychological exhaustion is a physical weight, a constant pressure behind my eyes. To play the perfect wife, I must anticipate his moods before they even settle in his mind. If he is arrogant, I must be adoring. If he is stressed about the Guggenheim, I must be a silent, soothing shadow. I am a ghostwriter for a life I no longer want to lead, editing my every impulse to fit the narrative of the troubled ward he rescued. It is a 24-hour performance with no intermission, and the theater is a battlefield where the only weapon I have is my silence. The studio remains our most dangerous encounter. Julian has become obsessed with the final portrait, sensing a new energy in my work that he, of course, attributes to his own superior guidance. He spends hours standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders, a grip that is supposed to be grounding but feels like the slow tightening of a noose. He critiques the way I've rendered his jawline, the way I've captured the wisdom in his eyes, never realizing that I am painting him with the clinical detachment of an undertaker preparing a body for a viewing. "You've captured it, Elena," he whispered yesterday, his breath warm against my neck. That spark, that sense of a man who has looked into the abyss and didn't blink. This is going to be the most talked about piece in New York history. Our legacy, finally set in stone. I felt a surge of nausea, so potent I had to grip the edge of the easel to keep from swaying. Our legacy. He says it as if we are two halves of a whole, rather than a parasite and its host. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn around and drag my nails across his perfect, visionary face. Instead, I leaned back into his touch, playing the part of the inspired muse. I let him believe he was the source of the fire, while I was merely the wick. "It's all because of you, Julian," I said, my voice a whisper of pure, distilled betrayal. "I wouldn't be here without you." He preened under the praise, his ego expanding to fill the room, blinding him to the razor-sharp intent in my eyes. This is the irony of the gaslighter. He is so convinced of his own brilliance that he cannot imagine a world where the victim is smarter than the predator. He thinks he has broken me so thoroughly that I have no self left to plot with. He sees my obedience as a symptom of my recovery, when in fact, it is the camouflage of my war. Dinner parties are the most grueling. Julian loves to display me like a prized, albeit fragile, trophy. We hosted a small gathering for some Guggenheim board members last night, and I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, wearing a dress of muted gray, the color of a fading memory. I watched him tell the story of our struggle, his hand resting possessively over mine as he described the dark months where my illness supposedly halted his work. "It was a heavy cross to bear," Julian told the table, his eyes shimmering with a practiced, saintly moisture. "There were nights I thought I'd lost her forever. But art is the only thing that brought us back. I poured my fear for her into every canvas. If the muse resonates, it's because it's a map of our survival." I watched the guests look at me with that unbearable, suffocating pity. I saw them nod in admiration at Julian's nobility. I sat there, a living prop in his theater of lies, and I realized that intimacy had become the ultimate battlefield. Every touch he gave me in front of these people was a claim of territory. Every kiss on the cheek was a brand. Even late at night, in the suffocating privacy of our bed, the intimacy is a lie. When he reaches for me, I have to pretend I am still the woman who loved him, the woman who believed his promises in 2016. I have to disconnect my mind from my body, letting him inhabit a shell while the real Elena retreats to the secret studio of her mind, counting the days. The exhaustion is starting to leave marks I can't hide with makeup. My hands shake when I'm alone. My hair is thinning at the temples. Julian sees it and smiles, calling it the beautiful fragility of the artistic spirit. He loves my decline because it validates his role as my guardian. He is feeding on my disappearance, never suspecting that the woman he thinks is fading is actually just concentrating her strength, like a spring being coiled tighter and tighter until the moment of release. After the guests left and Julian fell into his wine-heavy sleep, I crept back to the studio. I didn't turn on the main lights. I clicked on the UV torch, and the truth erupted from the canvas in a violent, electric blue. There, beneath the beautiful varnish of his visionary face, was the list of the medications he forced me to take to calm my nerves. There was the transcript of the night he told me I would be nothing without him. The contrast between the vibrant, screaming truth in the dark and the colorless, submissive lie in the light is enough to drive anyone mad. But I am not going mad. I am becoming a masterpiece of focus. I picked up the brush and added a final, microscopic detail to the corner of his eye, a tear made of quinine that would only show under the gala spotlights. It wasn't a tear of sorrow, it was a drop of venom. 45 days, Julian, I whispered to the empty room. I am tired of the waltz. I am tired of the eggshells, but I will keep dancing. I will play the perfect, submissive wife until the very second the music stops and the lights change. Because when the world finally sees what is hidden beneath the master's skin, they won't just see a thief. They will see the woman who played the most dangerous role in New York City and won. The battlefield of our intimacy is almost exhausted. Soon, there will be no more masks. Only the canvas, and the truth it refuses to keep. The canvas is no longer just a surface for capturing light. It has become a macabre vessel, a graveyard of buried truths. If you were to run your fingers across its surface, you would feel the rhythmic ridges and valleys of a heavy impasto, but you would never guess what lies beneath the skin of the oil paint. To Julian, these textures are evidence of his visceral creative struggle. To me, they are the stitches of an autopsy. Tonight, my tools are no longer just brushes and palette knives. I have a pair of surgical tweezers and a microscalpel, tools of precision for a crime of liberation. I am engaging in what conservators would call a betrayal of the medium. I am embedding the sharp, jagged edges of my reality into the very fabric of the fiction Julian is so desperate to sell. I start with the 2016 contract. I spent hours at a specialized printing shop in Queens last week, having the original document, the one that effectively signed my soul over to Julian Vane, shrunk down to microscopic dimensions. Using the tweezers, I carefully slide a sliver of the contract into a wet layer of zinc white just beneath the line of Julian's jaw. I press it down, feeling the resistance of the heavy pigment. It's a tiny thing, no larger than a grain of sand, but it contains the weight of a decade of theft. I cover it with a thick, confident stroke of paint, burying the evidence of his fraud under a layer of artistic genius. Next come the photographs. I have dozens of them, taken in secret over the years, blurry, hurried shots of my hands holding the brushes, my face illuminated by the harsh glow of the studio lamp while Julian slept soundly in the other room. I've printed these on ultra-thin silk paper, almost transparent. I layer them into the texture of his suit, right over his heart. Every time a critic praises the emotional resonance of his clothing in this portrait, they will be unknowingly staring at the proof that I was the one who breathed life into his vacuum. The most painful part of the process, however, is the medical reports. I take the shredded pages of the evaluations Julian had commissioned, the ones where he'd coached a high-priced psychiatrist to label me as paranoid and dissociative to ensure I stayed under his legal guardianship. I've pulped the paper, mixing it into my gesso to create a base texture that is literally made of my own gaslighting. I am sewing my trauma into the canvas, thread by agonizing thread. Each time I apply a new layer, I feel a strange, cold satisfaction. I am not just painting a portrait, I am building a dossier. The silence of the penthouse is shattered by the sound of the front door. My heart lurches into my throat, a frantic, trapped thing. Julian is home early. I hear the rhythmic click of his loafers on the marble, moving toward the studio. With a speed born of pure terror, I grab a large piece of linen and drape it over the canvas. I barely have time to set down the tweezers and pick up a palette knife before the door opens. Julian stands in the doorway, the cool hallway light framing him like a saint in a cathedral. He looks tired, but his eyes are still bright with the fever of the upcoming gala. "Still working, Elena? You're becoming as obsessed as I am," he says, his voice carrying that familiar, patronizing warmth. He walks toward the easel, his hand reaching out to lift the cloth. "Let me see. I want to see how the jawline is coming along. You mentioned you were trying something textural there." I step in front of him, my body a shield for the secrets beneath the cloth. My hands are slick with sweat and wet paint. "It's too wet, Julian. I just applied a heavy glazing layer to the lower half. If you lift the cloth now, the dust from the air will settle in the paint and ruin the finish. I need it to cure in the dark." Julian stops, his hand hovering just inches from the fabric. He narrows his eyes, a flicker of suspicion, or perhaps just his usual desire for control, crossing his face. "You're being very protective of this one, Elena. Even for you. I just want it to be perfect for you," I whisper, my voice a masterpiece of submissiveness. "This is your legacy, after all. I can't let a single speck of dust tarnish the vain touch." Julian's face softens, the ego winning out over the suspicion as it always does. He chuckles and pats my cheek, his fingers cold against my skin. "You're right, of course. My little perfectionist. Carry on then. But don't stay up too late. You're starting to look a bit peaked. We can't have you looking like a ghost at your own husband's coronation. He leaves, and the click of the lock follows shortly after. I collapse into my stool, my breath coming in jagged, ragged gasps. I look at my hands. The cuticles are stained with the dark, bruised purples of the paint, but they are also stained with the truth. I lift the cloth. The portrait of Julian stares back at me, noble, visionary, and utterly false. But I can see the slight, uneven bumps where the evidence is hidden. I see the ridges of the contract under his jaw. I see the silk paper photographs under his heart. The painting is becoming heavy, not just with pigment, but with the mass of a decade's worth of crimes. This is the act of stitching. I am repairing the hole in my history by filling it with the very things that try to erase me. Every micro-printed document and every shredded report is a stitch in the fabric of my new identity. I am the restorer who has stopped trying to hide the damage and has instead decided to make the repair the focal point. You think you're the visionary, Julian, I whisper to the painted eyes that look so much kinder than the real ones. But you're just the frame. I am the canvas, and I am finally full. There are only 30 days left. The truth is almost finished being sewn in. Soon, I won't be the only one who sees the ridges under the surface. Soon, the light will hit this canvas, and the world will see that the masterpiece of the decade is actually a confession, stitched together by the woman the master thought he had silenced forever. The penthouse smelled of white lilies and curated lies this afternoon. Julian had spent the morning obsessing over the arrangement of the living room, ensuring that every designer chair was positioned to capture the perfect amount of Manhattan's judgmental sunlight. Marcus Vallon was coming. In the ecosystem of the New York art world, Marcus was the apex predator, a man whose column in the Times could turn a canvas into gold or a career into ash. He was known as the Ghost Hunter, a critic with an uncanny ability to sniff out the hollow centers of overhyped sensations. Julian was terrified of him, which meant he was doubly cruel to me. He's almost here, Elena, Julian said, his voice a sharp, clinical blade. He didn't look at me as he straightened his linen cuffs. He was looking at his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass, admiring the visionary he had spent a decade building on my back. You know the drill. You're having a difficult day. The light is too much for your nerves. I've already told his assistant that you're resting in the library. If I hear so much as a floorboard creak, Elena, I swear the retreat in the Berkshires will become your permanent residence by Monday. The retreat, his favorite euphemism for the private psychiatric facility where he threatened to bury me whenever I showed a flicker of my own will. This was the psychological drama that defined our lives, a cycle of betrayal and elegant revenge played out in the most expensive rooms in America. He grabbed my upper arm, his thumb pressing into a bruise I'd hidden with heavy concealer, and steered me toward the library. The door clicked shut, and I heard the turn of the key, a sound that had become the rhythmic punctuation of my existence in this New York fortress. I stood in the darkness of a library, my forehead pressed against the cold mahogany of the door. I could hear the muffled chime of the elevator, the smooth, practiced warmth of Julian's greeting, and then the dry, gravelly voice of Marcus Vallon. They were walking toward the studio. They were walking toward my soul, which Julian had signed with his name. But I had been faster than his fear. Before he had locked me away, while Julian was busy berating the caterers, I had made a final trip to the studio. I didn't add any paint. Instead, I had reached for a tiny, vintage vial hidden in the lining of my apron clove oil. It was a traditional, almost archaic medium used by the old masters to slow the drying time of oil paints, a technique rarely taught in modern American art schools and never used by a fast and visceral painter like Julian claimed to be. I had applied a single, microscopic drop to the underside of the frame and another to the hem of the silk drop cloth. It was a scent that shouldn't be there. It was a sensory anomaly, a whispered, "Help me," in the language of the masters. "It's overwhelming, Julian," I heard Marcus say. His voice sounded closer now, filtering through the vents. "The depth of the layering in this portrait, it's quite a departure from your earlier, more aggressive work. There's a meticulousness here, a patience that feels almost feminine." I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Look closer, Marcus," I pleaded silently. Smell the air. See the ghost in the machine. I've had to slow down, Marcus, Julian replied, his voice dripping with that manufactured, martyr-like grace he used to sell the narrative of our struggle. Caring for Elena has changed my rhythm. I've had to learn a new kind of patience. I suppose her fragility has bled into my brushes. It's a heavy burden, but it's the only way I can truly honor her silence. The nausea was a cold weight in my stomach. He was using my imprisonment as a stylistic explanation for my own talent. He was weaving the bars of my cage into the fabric of his genius. This was the core of the psychological betrayal the user is exploring in this narrative, the elegant way a predator can rebrand his victim's erasure as his own emotional depth. And yet, Marcus's voice was sharper now, the sound of a man who had found a loose thread and was beginning to pull. The scent in here. It's not just linseed and turpentine. Is that clove? I haven't smelled clove oil in a working studio since I visited a restoration lab in Florence 10 years ago. It's a very specific, very old-world choice, Julian. I didn't know you studied the chemistry of the 17th century. There was a pause. I could almost see Julian's face paling, his mind frantically searching for a lie that wouldn't crumble. Ah, the clove. Yes, an experiment. I've been looking for ways to keep the soul of the paint alive longer. I wanted to reflect the lingering nature of Elena's condition. Fascinating, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. Most artists today prefer the speed of synthetics. To use such a rare, traditional oil, it suggests a hand that has spent thousands of hours in quiet, disciplined study. Not the kind of thing one picks up during a difficult season. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, my hands wrapped around my knees. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on my cheek. He smelled it. He knew. Or at least he suspected. For the first time in a decade, the desperate hope that someone could see the real me through the cracks in Julian's facade felt like more than a delusion. I wasn't just a troubled ward. I was a woman who knew the secrets of the masters, and I had left a trail of breadcrumbs in the air. Where is she today? Marcus asked abruptly. I'd like to speak with her. The muse behind the muse. Surely she can shed some light on this new, meticulous Julian vein. I'm afraid that's impossible, Julian said, his voice turning cold, the saint mask slipping just a fraction. She's had a relapse. The excitement of the gala, it's too much for her. She's quite delicate, Marcus. I have to protect her from the world, even from admirers like you. Protect her, Marcus repeated. The word hung in the air, heavy and ambiguous. You certainly have a very comprehensive way of protecting her, Julian. This penthouse, the silence, the scent of a master studio in a house where the artist says he's a self-taught visionary. It's a very compelling story. I heard the sound of footsteps moving away, the elevator chime, and then the heavy, oppressive silence returned to the penthouse. A few minutes later, the key turned in the lock. Julian stood in the doorway, his face twisted in a silent, vibrating rage. You left the oil open, he hissed, grabbing my chin and forcing me to look at him. He noticed. He's a bloodhound, Elena, and you almost gave him something to bite. Do you have any idea how much work I've put into making sure the world believes I'm the one holding the brush? If you ever try a stunt like that again, any clue, any scent, I will make sure you never see a tube of paint again. He shoved me back into the room and slammed the door. But as I sat there in the dark, I didn't feel the usual crushing weight of defeat. I felt a spark. Marcus Vallon hadn't just seen a painting. He had smelled a secret. The elegant revenge I was planning wasn't just about the gala anymore. It was about the fact that no matter how much Julian tried to erase me, the truth had a scent. It was a scent of cloves and ancient discipline, and it was currently haunting the mind of the most powerful critic in New York. 30 days. The countdown was no longer just a march toward a Pamaran. It was a march toward a reckoning. The air in the studio tonight is thick, not with the hopeful scent of creation, but with the suffocating sweetness of varnish, the final, glossy protective layer over a decade of stolen breath. It is a sickly, resinous smell that clings to the back of my throat, a reminder that the cage is now officially locked. The painting is finished. Under the harsh, clinical LED lights of the penthouse, the visionary's portrait looks back at me with a terrifying, artificial nobility. Julian has spent the afternoon pacing in front of it, his chest expanded with the pride of a man who believes he has just secured his immortality. He sees a masterpiece. I see a tombstone. "It's perfect, Elena," he whispered earlier, his hand tracing the air inches from the canvas, as if he were afraid to touch the divine. History will look at this moment as the dawn of the new vein. They'll see the depth, the isolation, the sheer technical brilliance. They'll see a man who transcended his own humanity. He didn't see the micro-printed shreds of my psychiatric reports embedded in the shadow of his lapel. He didn't see the invisible, lead-white words of my stolen journals woven into the highlights of his hair. He saw only the beautiful, polished lie he had commissioned me to paint. Now we are sitting in the dining room for what Julian has called our victory dinner. The table is a vast, cold expanse of white marble, set with baccarat crystal and silver that gleams like surgical instruments. Outside, the Manhattan skyline is a tapestry of electric indifference, millions of people living their lives while I sit here, a ghost at my own feast. Julian has poured a 2004 Krug, the bubbles rising in the flutes like tiny, golden souls trying to escape. "To us," Julian says, raising his glass. The light catches the sharp angles of his face, making him look like one of the statues he so desperately wishes he could be. "To the end of the long night, and the beginning of a legacy that will outlive every critic in this city." I raise my glass, the crystal cold against my fingertips. "To the truth," I whisper. Julian laughs, a rich, confident sound that echoes hollowly against the glass walls. "Yes, darling. To the truth. To the version of the truth we've crafted together." He takes a long sip, then sets his glass down with a definitive clack. He looks at me, and for a moment, the performative warmth in his eyes vanishes, replaced by something cold, clinical, and terrifyingly efficient. "Which brings us to what happens after the gala tomorrow, Elena." I feel a prickle of dread crawl up my spine. "After the gala? We both know the strain this has put on you," he says, his voice shifting into that patronizing, saintly register he uses for the public. He reaches across the table and covers my hand with his. His palm is dry, his grip firm. "This masterpiece, it took everything you had left. I've watched you fade, Elena. I've watched the fog take over. And as your husband, as your guardian, I cannot allow you to wither away in this studio anymore. You've done your part. You've given the world what it needs." He reaches into the pocket of his tailored blazer and pulls out a small, glossy brochure. He slides it across the marble toward me. The title, embossed in elegant silver script, reads, "Silver Oaks Retreat and Wellness Center." I don't need to open it to know what it is. I know the location, the Berkshire Mountains, far away from the prying eyes of the New York art scene, far away from the galleries, far away from any way to reach the world. It is a sanatorium for the elite, a gilded cage where the inconvenient are sent to be forgotten under the guise of recovery. "I've already made the arrangements," Julian says, his voice as smooth as the varnish on the canvas. "A private suite, the best doctors, total seclusion, no distractions, no brushes, no paints to aggravate your condition. You'll stay there for a few months, or as long as it takes for the fog to clear. I'll visit you, of course, whenever the tour allows." The realization hits me like a physical blow to the chest, leaving me breathless. He isn't just sending me away to rest. He is disappearing me. Now that the final masterpiece is finished, now that he has the vain touch secured for the next decade of his career, I am no longer an asset. I am a liability. I am the only witness to his fraud, and he is moving to bury me in the mountains before I can ever find my voice. "You're disposing of me," I say, my voice sounding strange and distant, like a recording played from another room. Julian's eyes narrow, the protector, mask slipping just enough to show the predator beneath. "I am saving you, Elena. From yourself. From the madness that clearly thinks I would do anything other than act in your best interest. You're unwell. The gala tomorrow will be your last public appearance for a long time. It's for the best. For the legacy. For the brand." I look down at the brochure. The images of lush green lawns and sterile, smiling nurses look like a death sentence. He intends to lock me in the Berkshires while he travels the world, basking in the glory of the work I bled for. He will tell everyone I am recovering, and eventually, people will stop asking. Elena Vane will become a tragic whisper in the footnotes of his biography, the brilliant but broken wife who lost her mind to the shadows. "Drink your champagne, Elena," he says, his voice firming up into a command. "Tomorrow is a big day. I want you to look your best. I want the world to see exactly what I'm protecting before you go." I pick up the glass. My hands are not shaking. The fear has passed through me and left behind a cold, crystalline fury. I realize now that my elegant revenge isn't just about reclaiming my art. It is a battle for my very existence. If I don't break him tomorrow, I will never have another chance. The Guggenheim isn't just a gallery, it's my only courtroom. I look Julian in the eye and take a sip of the vintage Krug. It tastes like ash and iron. "I'll be ready, Julian," I say. He smiles, satisfied that he has won, that the troubled ward has been successfully managed one last time. He begins to talk about his speech, about the lighting at the museum, about the celebrities who have confirmed their attendance. I stop listening. I am thinking about the UV lights I've sabotaged. I am thinking about the chemical reaction I've sown into the heart of his portrait. I am thinking about the moment when the visionary will be stripped of his borrowed light, and I will be the only one left standing. He thinks this is the last supper of my career. He doesn't realize it's the last night he will ever be Julian Vane. As we finish the meal in a silence, so heavy it feels like it could shatter the glass walls, I look out at New York one last time as a ghost. Tomorrow, the fog won't just lift, it will ignite. I walk to my bedroom. Julian's good night, a distant, muffled sound. I lie in the dark, my eyes wide, waiting for the fajar. I am no longer afraid of the Berkshires. I am no longer afraid of the shadows. I am the artist, and I am finally ready to sign my work. The sound of the front door closing was a sharp, final percussion that vibrated through the floorboards of the penthouse, echoing against the floor-to-ceiling glass like the strike of a gavel. Julian was gone. He had left early, driven by the frantic, narcissistic hunger for the spotlight, needing to be there to greet the trustees and the press, to bask in the pre-show adulation before his masterpiece was unveiled to the world. Before he left, he had stopped by my room, leaning over me while I pretended to doze, whispering that he had left the gray silk on the chair, a dress the color of ash, the color of a woman who was supposed to be fading away. "Stay in bed as long as you need, Elena," he had murmured, his voice thick with a fake, saintly concern. "The driver will be here at 8. Just smile, stay close to me, and let the world see how well I've taken care of you. After tonight, the Berkshires will give you all the peace you've ever wanted." I waited until the elevator's hum disappeared into the depths of the building before I sat up. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the Manhattan skyline outside, a city that was about to witness the most expensive autopsy in its history. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly steady. The fragility Julian had spent a decade cultivating falling away from me like a discarded, moth-eaten shroud. I didn't even look at the gray silk. Instead, I walked to the back of the walk-in closet, reaching behind the bar of designer labels and muted neutrals until I felt the cold, heavy weight of the garment I had hidden months ago. The carmine dress. It was the color of raw pigment, a deep, visceral alizarin crimson that looked like blood before it has a chance to dry. It was the color of an open wound, but also the color of the most expensive paint on a master's palette. As I pulled it from its silk bag, the fabric felt like liquid fire against my palms. This wasn't a dress for a troubled ward or a fragile muse. It was a dress for a woman who was ready to bleed the truth onto the marble floors of the Guggenheim. I began the ritual of preparation, and for the first time in 10 years, it didn't feel like I was dressing a corpse. I looked at my body in the full-length mirror, really looking at it without the filter of Julian's disapproval. I was thin, yes, but the lines of my shoulders were sharp, and my hands, the hands that had painted every vein for the last decade, were steady as stone. I was reclaiming my skin, reclaiming the muscles that had held the brush while the world slept. I applied my makeup with the same surgical precision I used for glazing a canvas. I didn't want the soft, dewy look Julian preferred to make me appear innocent. I wanted sharp lines. I used a dark, obsidian liner to define my eyes, turning them into 2 dark focal points that refused to blink. I painted my lips in a shade of red that matched the dress, a bold, unapologetic stroke of defiance. This wasn't vanity, it was war paint. I was layering my own identity back onto a face that had been erased, one careful application at a time. When I slipped into the dress, the silk hissed against my skin, a secret language shared between the creator and her armor. It fit perfectly, hugging the curves Julian had tried to hide under oversized cashmere, and falling to the floor in a heavy, dramatic sweep. I felt a strange, cold power radiating from the color. In the world of art, carmine is a fugitive color. It fades when exposed to too much light. But tonight, I was the one who was going to use the light to expose the dark. I walked back into the studio for one final moment. The room was empty now, the portrait of Julian already transported to the museum, but the scent of linseed oil and turpentine still lingered like a ghost. I stood in the spot where I had spent thousands of hours in silence, building a man who didn't exist. I thought about the Berkshires, about the retreat Julian had planned as my final destination. He wanted to bury me in the mountains, so he could keep the ghost in the machine and never have to look it in the eye. You should have left me a little more light, Julian, I whispered to the empty easel. You shouldn't have taught me how to find my way through the dark. I picked up a small, elegant clutch. Inside was the modified UV torch, its weight a comforting secret. I checked the time, 7:55 p.m. The driver would be downstairs. I took one last look at the Manhattan skyline, the lights of the city twinkling like a billion witnesses. Tonight, the city wouldn't see the visionaries muse. They would see the visionaries judge. As I walked toward the elevator, the silence of the penthouse no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the breath an artist takes right before the first stroke hits the canvas, a moment of infinite, terrifying possibility. I was no longer afraid of the shadows because I had learned to paint with them. I was no longer afraid of the fog because I was the one who had choreographed the storm. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, the carmine silk pooling around my feet like a rising tide. I hit the button for the lobby and watched the floor numbers count down to my liberation. The Fajar wasn't coming from the sky tonight. It was coming from the basement of my soul, and it was going to be the most beautiful, Menyayat thing New York had ever seen. I am Elena. I am the artist. And tonight, the world will finally read my signature.